Hey y'all, today we're going to do our second recording, our second learn session for techniques and elements of fiction. So what does that mean? We're going to talk about fiction genres right now. When you speak about genres in literature, it means a category or type of story. And that makes sense because not everything is black and white, right? There has to be some type of grouping. There's always gray areas, and it's no different with fiction. Fiction has what are called subgenres, and we're going to talk about those today. Think of it this way. Music, we all like different types. Some of us like country, punk, disco, wedding. We have all kinds of genres of music, and it's no different than fiction. Fiction, we're going to see, has different types, just like music has different types. So let's see what that's all about. Well, first of all, books are divided into two main categories, and I shouldn't have said books. Literature really is divided into two main categories, and actually it's divided into four, but we're going to leave two out today and just look at the two major ones. And those two major ones are fiction and nonfiction. Now, you're hearing me talk about nonfiction, and we haven't talked about that yet, but that's okay. Don't worry, because remember, we're focusing on fiction right now. So when we think about these big categories of literature, we have fiction, we have nonfiction. Right now, we're focusing just on fiction. No panicking, everyone. So before we move any further, let's just review really quickly what fiction actually is. So first things first, we understand that fiction is made up. It might have characters and places and events that are familiar, but that's done on purpose. Those are author decisions. Fiction takes many different forms, including poetry, notes, songs, novels, short stories, narrative essays, and movies. So many ways that someone can write fiction. Also, fiction authors make decisions. These stories are based on something, and there is such a broad range of things on which they can base their stories. Just look at the world around you. And we know that authors generally include all of the elements of a story when they write. That means characters, and we have to use characterization to figure out those characters. That means point of view. The author chooses if their story is going to be told in first person, third person limited, or third person omniscient. They choose their setting, and their setting typically creates a mood that's in line with whatever they want you to feel about this story: scary, sad, happy. We have a plot, which is beginning to end of the story, sometimes with flashbacks in it, sometimes with foreshadowing, but basically that's the this, then that, the this, then that happened, right? And we begin with exposition and we climb up and it's all action, 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 and then we hit a climax at the top and we come down the other side with falling action and the story's over. So it's a perfect triangle. And we have theme, and that's what readers get from reading fiction. What are they reminded of, or what do they learn from what the characters go through within the story? And remember, all of these things are carefully created in an author's mind before they even start to write. And finally, authors have a purpose when they write and may want to just entertain you, or they may want to motivate you by making you relate to the character settings and events. Their goal might be to give you instructions through their literature. There's so many reasons that an author may choose to write fiction. They have a goal in mind, and we call that their purpose. So moving on, we're going to get back to our genres discussion. We're talking about the big genre called fiction. So fiction is fiction, just like basically a dog is a dog, no matter what it looks like. We all have different dogs. We all see different dogs. A dog is a dog, right? They bark like a dog, they sleep like a dog, they eat like a dog, they wag their tail like a dog is a dog. Well, fiction is fiction. None of that changes in fiction. No matter what type or subgenre of fiction you're reading, you're going to see that it has all the elements and techniques that we've already talked about. Just like even if a dog wags his tail up and down instead of side to side, it's still a dog. Okay, so again, no matter what it looks like, just like we talked about in our last session, we have novel, which is fiction. We have Disney, which is fiction. So no matter how we change it, no matter how much we dress it up or dress it down, fiction is fiction and has all the elements of fiction. But what we want to get into is kind of the nitty-gritty of that, because sometimes fiction can be divided further according to what it has in common with other subgenres of fiction. So there we have it. Sometimes two stories have such similar techniques. The author used such similar techniques and used specific settings that made it very similar to another. So they started grouping all of these pieces of fiction into little subgroups, depending on what they had in common. So those are called subgenres. So again, we have this big fiction category up here, and underneath there we have all these little subgenres. They have all the elements of fiction, but they have things that are unique to them. Let's see what that's all about. So we have traditional literature or traditional fiction. We have fantasy fiction. We have science fiction. We have realistic fiction, historical fiction, and mystery. So let's take a closer look at what each of these are. Fiction genres, first one up is fantasy. When you're reading fantasy, you're going to recognize it. It's fiction, first of all, we all know that, but it's a story including elements that are impossible, such as talking animals or magical powers. So you'll recognize fantasy when you see it. Second one up is realistic fiction. Now, realistic fiction is really cool. I had mentioned earlier that an author can base things on the world around him, but when he really gets into doing things that could happen in real life, it's called realistic fiction. And that's very similar to the Ebola story that our author unfolded for us and made decisions about in our previous video. It's called realistic fiction. Next up, we have mystery, and mystery is a suspenseful story about a puzzling event that is not solved until the end of the story. These are detective stories, and I know a lot of students really like them. Next up is historical fiction. Now, this is really cool because historical fiction is a story that takes place in a particular time period in the past. The setting is real. This isn't going to be made up. This is actually going to be a battle in the Civil War. That's going to be the setting, or it's going to be in colonial times. We all know that colonial times existed. Or it could be in gladiator times. So the setting is real. We recognize that that's a part of our history, a part of our evolution as a nation. This place really existed. This battle really existed. But the characters are made up. If any of you have ever seen the movie Titanic, that is historical fiction. The Titanic did sink. It did hit an iceberg. It did sink. But all those characters were made up. Okay, there was no one, I'm sure there were people on the ship that found love, but there was no one that went through that specific sequence of events that was made up. Next, we have traditional literature, and traditional literature are stories that are passed down from one group to another in history. This includes folk tales, legends, fables, fairy tales, tall tales, myths from different cultures. This is the oral tradition, they call it. And these stories have been passed from generation to generation to generation because people have told them over and over again. And finally, we have science fiction, and science fiction is a type of fantasy that uses science and technology, robots, time machines, aliens, and things like that. So those are your separate subgroups of fiction. So again, they all have the fictional elements. They're all going to have characters and settings, but the characters are going to be different depending on which subgenre you're writing or reading. So fantasy is going to have unicorns for characters, whereas realistic fiction is going to have people as characters. Mystery is going to have detectives, and it's going to have a plot that unfolds as a mystery, whereas historical fiction may not be so mysterious. It's going to maybe be straightforward, depending on the time period and the characters. So you're going to see that they have all the elements of fiction, but what makes them different are their plots and their characters and their settings. So, let's play Name That Subgenre. As I told you in a previous video, I feel like a talk show host or a game show host when I do these things. So let's go ahead and play Name That Subgenre. Oh my God, so excited. I know y'all are. So let's go ahead and see if we can identify these subgenres that I have up on the board here. Subgenre number 1, stories that are passed down from one group to another in history. This genre or subgenre includes folk tales, legends, fables, fairy tales, tall tales, and myths from different cultures. Do y'all know what it is? Let's take a look at our options. mystery, science fiction, traditional literature, fantasy, historical fiction, realistic fiction. Which one is it, guys and gals? Folk tales, legends. Here's a clue for you. Passed down from one generation to another. Do you know what it is? Well, let's get some help. This is traditional literature. This one. I think the cat's adorable. So traditional literature, that's what we just described. This is traditional fiction. Next up, we have a story including elements that are impossible, such as talking animals or magic powers. Make-believe is what this genre is all about. So which one is that? Make-believe. Where does that lead us to? Make-believe is fantasy. This one. Next up, we have genre number 3, type of fantasy that uses science and technology, robots, time machines. You all know this one. Did you choose science fiction? Then you got it right. And next up, we have genre 4, story using made-up characters and events that could happen in real life. There's a hint in there for you. Did you choose realistic fiction? You got that one right. And next up, we have a fictional story that takes place in a particular time period in the past. There's your clue. Often the setting is real, but the characters are made up from the author's imagination. Isn't everything in fiction? I don't know. So, did you guess that this answer was historical fiction? Then you got it right. Next up, and finally, we have genre number 6, a suspenseful story about a puzzling event that is not solved until the end of the story. Sounds a little bit like mystery to me. Did you guess that? I bet you did. All right, a few final things. Oh my God, there's more? Just a little bit more, I promise. Pay attention to an author's style when you're reading fiction because they all have their own. All right, sentence types and lengths may vary depending on the author. Organization may vary. You may see a shift in settings. Some authors love to do that. Using a lot of dialogue. Again, some authors love that. Using a lot of imagery, description, and creating unique characters. Basically, anything that seems exclusive to that author or that stands out as being done purposely is probably a style. So that's it, everybody. I'll see you in class.